comment. So I started using Duolingo in 2014 when I was just 15 years old with the goal of learning Spanish and French with a pretty big initial daily usage streak. So I had 1,656 days is my first streak on Duolingo, and I currently have a streak of 876 days. So if we add all those up together, both of those up together, it's 2,532 days, which is a little less than 7 years, but this doesn't include all of the days that I used Duolingo outside of my two longest streaks. I've used Duolingo about 7 years of my life. The 7 years of my life have been days where I've used Duolingo. So I think I've earned the admittedly petty position of expert on Duolingo. I've seen how it's made many changes, often to balance how fun it feels to a large portion of its user base and how efficient it is as a learning tool. And I'm here to tell you what about Duolingo works, what doesn't, what used to work better, and more importantly, how you can better study a language whether you use Duolingo or not. So, the first thing I learned is admittedly not that exciting, is that you have to practice speaking and creating sentences in your target language to improve. When I started, I already knew a little bit of French, and I wanted to do two things. I wanted to improve my French and I wanted to learn Spanish. Now, learning a language that's related to another language you already know is generally easier. If you're an English speaker, it's easier to learn Dutch than if you're a Chinese speaker trying to learn Dutch, because Dutch is closer to English. Likewise, if you're a Japanese speaker, because of the similarity in the writing system, it'll be easier for you to learn Chinese than it is for a native English speaker to learn Chinese. But there are several ways in which learning two related languages at the same time is significantly harder. Most notably, the time commitment. Simply, it takes more time. You have to learn two things instead of one. And there's a certain risk of mixing things up. If you speak some Spanish and you're learning Portuguese, or in my case, French, you might want to use a French word while you're speaking Spanish because in your head they're related words, or you might think that the French word is a Spanish word. You might just give it like a Spanish accent, and then you'll try and use it, and it might be a different word. It might not exist, or it might exist in the other language, but with a different meaning. That can be a bit difficult. However, Duolingo offers a wonderful way that I could manage both of these problems, that I could save time and avoid mixing them up. By studying French from Spanish, I managed to learn to keep both languages separated and to combine my study time. And honestly, I think this helped me ignore one of the biggest pitfalls of Duolingo, which is the inefficient use of time. One of the most common exercises on Duolingo involves either translating to or from your native language, which means a significant portion of your cognitive effort is going into thinking in your native language and not in your target language. But when both languages are your target language, none of the time feels wasted. Like when I study other languages on Duolingo from English, I feel like I'm wasting my time thinking in English. But if you're just thinking in Spanish and French all the time, and those are the two languages you want to know, it feels a lot more efficient. And actually, this was a surprise to me because I thought this way I was going to learn French better than I learned Spanish. But I think my time doing this, learning French from Spanish, that was Spanish was the language Duolingo thought I spoke, and French was the language it thought I was learning. I think this way my time might have actually been more efficient learning Spanish as the base language because it meant I spent more time translating into Spanish. I had to practice production more than just passively understanding Spanish. And basically, using the language is multiple skills. It's often split up into reading, writing, listening, and speaking. Although all of these things could be separated further into micro skills, or they're different layouts. But because I was translating into Spanish, it helped me much more with my writing and speaking than it did my French. Another way of thinking about this is with the idea of active and passive vocabulary. When you first see a word, for instance, you probably won't remember it. Like, if I tell you, for example, the Portuguese for armadillo is tatu, you might not remember the word, but you might remember that you've seen it before. You might come across the word in a text and know that you know it, but you might not remember what it means exactly. And as it solidifies in your passive vocabulary, you will be able to understand it more and more naturally until it seems as if it were a word in your native language. Similarly, if you're trying to speak Portuguese, you might remember that you had already heard what the word for armadillo was in Portuguese, but struggled to get to come for it to come to mind. But as this word solidifies in your active vocabulary, the word tatu will come to you more and more naturally, as well as things like its gender and other common words that accompany it, or how it might change meaning in certain regions or contexts. Basically, knowing a word isn't a binary thing, it's a spectrum, and on one end is not knowing it at all, and on the other end is this kind of being an expert on the word, where we hear it and you know what else surrounds this word. And by translating into Spanish, I was getting more practice adding words into my active vocabulary, being able to recall and use those words when I wanted to use them, than in French, where I was getting a lot more passive practice, where I was seeing the words and then interpreting them into, realistically, it was probably in translating into English and then into Spanish in my head. But I think this method got me to kind of move away from the English step in this process and move more directly from translating into French from Spanish, especially because they were two related languages, and a lot of times the grammar, the underlying structure was a lot more similar in French than Spanish. So it's a nice kind of speedway into a shortcut into really kind of understanding both of these languages better. But ultimately, Duolingo was never enough by itself to learn a language. I don't think that's a controversial statement. I don't think there are a lot of people who are saying, "Oh yeah, you use Duolingo and then you can do that until you're fluent," because it doesn't work that well. And also, why would you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to go out and presumably you're learning a language for a reason. It might be to talk to people, it might be to travel, it might be to watch movies or read books. Whatever the thing you want to do is, eventually you can just start doing that thing. And that's really going to be a much more effective way of learning. And we can see this with my strongest language, which is by far Spanish. In conjunction with Duolingo, I spent about 2 weeks somewhat intensively studying grammar for a minimum of 2 hours per day before I felt like I'd kind of covered the basics. I didn't fully understand it, but I felt like I had seen everything at least once or twice that I was likely to encounter. And then I tried to reinforce what I did learn with Duolingo and expand my vocabulary. I moved on to, well, while doing this, I moved on to reading the Harry Potter books in Spanish because I was already very familiar with them. As I'd read them a lot in English as a former Harry Potter fan. And after about a year of practice with some videos, with reading with Duolingo, I did finish the Duolingo, not the Spanish tree, but the French tree from Spanish, and I found myself in a situation where I needed to speak Spanish regularly for several hours every day. And my Spanish improved a lot. I had trouble with comprehension at first, but it improved through practice. And I practiced a lot. I even lived in a Spanish speaking country for some time. And I started adding in more advanced grammar and vocabulary into my active usage until my current state, where I'm pretty comfortable speaking in Spanish about many niche topics. I like to read novels in Spanish. It's not very hard. Even novels written for adults, even literary novels. Generally, I have to look about a word per page, less for easy books and more for harder literature. So if I'm reading a play from the 1500s, I'm gonna have to look up a lot of words. If I'm reading like a modern romance book, I might have to look up a word every few pages or something like that. And even then, at that point, it's likely not detrimental to my understanding if I just kind of skip over that word and go with the flow, see what I can understand, and look it up if it's really important. I can watch movies unassisted in Spanish, which is really cool. That's a fun thing I like to do. And I was like, oh yeah, I speak Spanish. I can just watch a movie and I don't need subtitles. It's still kind of a shock, even after like several years of being able to do this. I like to write in Spanish. I can write kind of high school level essays, maybe with a few mistakes here and there. And I'd like to improve that. I'm about a C1 in Spanish, but I'd like to reach a C2 by reading more, by expanding my vocabulary, by writing more, and ironing out a few of the mistakes. There are some mistakes I'm aware that I make, And I think that's why writing really helps me because when I'm writing, I have time to think it over and write it out, and then I can read it again and I can go, oh no, this is the mistake I always use. I always commit. But when I'm speaking, it's much harder to catch yourself in the moment. And the more you practice the correct way of speaking, the more natural it feels, and the easier you can adapt into a new way of speaking. Portuguese is my next strongest language, probably about a B2. I did the Duolingo Portuguese tree when I was a teenager, and because it's similar to Spanish, I managed to get a place where. And then Portuguese is my next strongest language, probably about a B2. I did the Duolingo Portuguese tree, and because it's similar to Spanish, I managed to get to a place where I could read it fairly easily, and I started talking to people on apps like Hello Talk. Although I later realized I had problems with pronunciation and comprehension because I relied too heavily on Spanish phonology, on Spanish sound systems, and I didn't properly learn Portuguese pronunciation and phonology. And I think this is a big problem with Duolingo. I think with any language, I would now spend some time in the beginning really making sure I knew how to pronounce all the individual sounds and have some idea of how they might change next to other sounds. I'm currently doing something similar with Italian. So I'd done the Duolingo Italian tree a long time ago, and now I'm going back and I'm learning kind of the basics of Italian grammar and pronunciation and phonology to make sure I don't have the same problem I had in Portuguese, where I get to a place where I'm pretty comfortable speaking, but realize I have a really bad accent and I have trouble understanding other people because I didn't do the work to lay a good foundation of phonological knowledge. And I think this is going to affect some people more than others. I have a lot of trouble understanding in general, so I really have to study it a lot. I think for other people it comes a bit more naturally. And there's always the question like what kind of accent are you comfortable having? You know, if you have like a fairly thick accent but people still understand you, and you're okay with that, that's fine. And some people might want, a bit of a smoother accent. Some people might make the same number of mistakes per word in pronunciation, but they might be mistakes that make it harder to understand the other person. And some people, as I said, will just have an easier time understanding other people, whether they're really familiar with all the phonological details or not. My next strongest language is probably French. I probably have about a B1. I've never done a French test. After the Duolingo tree, I didn't really take care of my French until college, where I did study it for 2 years, which I think really did enforce my reading ability, but didn't help me actually speak the language. I abandoned it again, but a few years ago, I started hosting a weekly French Zoom group that has helped me maintain and improve my French. I can understand cartoons fairly easily. I can read complex novels without all that much trouble, but I have a strong accent and I mess up speaking. And I have trouble when people don't speak very clearly. I have trouble understanding them. And the problem is that native speakers very rarely speak their language clearly. And I think with a bit more effort into the grammar and producing the language with a fair bit of comprehension practice, I could quickly move to a strong B2 in French because I have a good underlying knowledge of a lot of the other parts of the language and vocabulary. For German and Greek, I did the Duolingo course for both, but I can't really use either if I'm being honest. I put a fair bit of effort into reading German, even reading some German children's novels, but unfortunately, I can no longer use it much outside of that. But I do have an idea for a video I want to make this summer or spring where I solidify my basic German knowledge. It seems like a kind of a fun idea. I'm going to use some fairy tales. It'll be a good time. For Greek, I had studied ancient Greek in college, and I was interested in how it evolved over the years into modern Greek, but I never actually used my Greek outside of Duolingo. And so after I completed the Duolingo Greek course, that was kind of it. And I would like to return to modern Greek at some point, but probably not with Duolingo. I have some honorable mentions here for Guarani, Latin, and Hawaiian. I completed all of these courses, but they were pretty small. And the Guarani course was particularly poorly made. I think you can't even sign up for the Guarani course anymore, and the Hawaiian course, I think, has been heavily revamped since I took it at least. After completing all of the treaties for these languages, the Duolingo treaties or courses, they're now more often called because the Duolingo course no longer looks like a tree. I was in college. I had a several years long streak, and I was doing the bare minimum every day to keep the streak alive. I tried studying some other languages, but I lost motivation, and I really didn't want to go deeper on some of the languages I had already studied, and I couldn't do that with Duolingo. And honestly, I was stressed out trying to keep my streak, just because it was a big number, and I really didn't have a better reason to keep it, and I had other things to do, so I stopped. And when I first started, I found the streak to be very useful as a motivation to see all the days I had studied, and it motivated me to do at least the bare minimum every day. And then I often went above and beyond to do more than the bare minimum. And I probably wouldn't have done that if I didn't have all this built up motivation from keeping the streak. But when most of my learning wasn't even happening on Duolingo, and I was stressed out. I knew it was time to let it go. But I think that is something that helps a lot of people. It helps me. And when I'm trying to build other habits, if I'm trying to exercise more, if I'm trying to study outside of Duolingo, if I'm trying to maintain any other kind of good habit, for me, having a streak is really helpful. And it's good to keep in mind for me to have a bare minimum that I really do try and go for. So I know I did the bare minimum all of these days in a row, and I can do the bare minimum today if I really don't feel like doing more. And most of the time, once I actually start and once I get into it, I want to do more than the bare minimum. I think some people might literally go on and it's just, they'll spend 5 seconds on Duolingo every day and it's not really helping them. And I think some people have rough days where they spend 5 seconds on Duolingo, and then better days where they spend, maybe half an hour, maybe an hour, a more substantial amount of time studying. And after I gave up my streak, occasionally I came back to practice a little bit of a language here or there. I remember like when the Finnish course came out, I was like, oh yeah, I'm so excited. I want to learn like a little bit of Finnish. And so I did. I learned a very tiny amount of Finnish. And now, more than about 2 years ago, I finally came back to Duolingo to learn Catalan. It's another Romance language. So I kind of cheated my way through the course, and then I studied the parts I actually cared about the most. And I quickly moved on to trying to talk to real people in Catalan and read books in Catalan. I've had some trouble finding more consistent conversation partners in Catalan, but I found several books I've been able to read in Catalan without too much difficulty. I like to make videos in other languages, and that's something I've thought about doing with Catalan. I have some books. I can try and write out a script, kind of practice it a little bit, make some videos in Catalan about things I've read in Catalan, but I really would like to find, more consistent more consistent conversation partners at some point. And I went through a similar process with Haitian Creole, but it's been notably harder to find books written in Haitian Creole. So I can find some people to practice with, but I really like reading. That's how I get a lot of my practice done. And ideally I'd like to be able to do both. So that's been kind of a snag for me. But I do have some books in Haitian Creole that I really like. And I've also been trying with a language that wasn't a Romance language. That's Indonesian, and I use Duolingo to learn the basics of language. And now I am trying to talk to Indonesians and read books in Indonesian with more success than I had with Catalan and Haitian Creole, just because it's easier to find people who want to practice than in Catalan, and it's easier to find books than Haitian Creole. And I really did. I found Duolingo to be a useful tool for all of these languages to varying degrees, even if it's less so with the languages I learned later on. And when I did find myself trying to study a language that doesn't have a Duolingo course, like I've studied some Nahuatl. I wish there was a Guarani course now. I've studied some Galician, some other languages from Spain. I really wish there was a Duolingo course. I think that would be very helpful for me. And as I've already stated, I do still maintain a streak on Duolingo, but it's not so much, if I'm being honest with myself, it's not really to learn languages. Duolingo has been an incredibly valuable tool throughout my life, and it's had a very positive effect on me. And I do not think I would know as much about language and languages as I do now had it not been for Duolingo. But ultimately, learning a language takes hundreds, if not more realistically speaking, thousands of hours. And perhaps, in part because I've become a better student since when I was 15, or because Duolingo has simply become a worse tool, it is now no longer the place where I wish to spend a substantial portion of my study time. It's still fun. I still enjoy exploring languages 5 minutes at a time. I was writing the highlights to make this video of things to talk about, and I thought, oh wow, I really would like to go back and do like the new Hawaiian course. That seems like a fun thing. I don't want to learn Hawaiian. I just want to do some of the Duolingo Hawaiian course for its own sake. But I know it's really not a place where I'm going to be doing much serious studying. And although it does have a special place in my heart, honestly, it is a bit difficult to see it slowly degrade in quality. Even simple things like how you type in an answer are worse than how they used to be. You used to have to actually type in an answer. I feel like an old man talking about the good old days of Duolingo. But when they added in languages like Japanese and Chinese, they changed it. So you often had word banks. Basically, you're given a list of words and you have to select the right ones and put them into order, and this eliminates the need to move words into your active vocabulary to produce them without any hint as to the actual shape of the word. And as someone who struggles with spelling in every language, it makes me less likely to learn how to spell words correctly and be able to think of them in the moment when I need them. And functionally, the new version is far easier to use. It's easier to go through a Duolingo lesson now than it used to be, but it's far less efficient. The reason they adopted this change is because it's an easier version, and an easier version is more popular. And this is something that's important to understand about Duolingo. Whenever there's a choice between user retention and more efficient learning, Duolingo will choose user retention over efficient learning. Now, there are two main reasons. First, is the more cynical one. Duolingo is a for-profit company, and they want you to use their products. Some people even think that Duolingo has purposely made their content worse in order to make it a slower learning process, in order to draw it out, even though you could learn the language faster, just to keep you as a user for longer. If you complete the course and then you leave, Duolingo actually might not like that. Now, I don't know if that's true. I think it's probably a bit complicated. There might be like competing factors in there. I don't know what percentage of people this would really be a concern for. I don't think most Duolingo users really do reach a point where they finish the tree. I think it's probably more like gym memberships where people, sign up for the gym and they go for a bit and then they forget that they had a gym membership and then they just continue to pay to use Duolingo even though they don't use it. And so if they stop using Duolingo, I don't know how many people are really going to quit their Duolingo membership because of that, or if they're going to continue just because, they're still on the tree, on the path. And the second reason that Duolingo will choose user retention is not as cynical and a lot more understandable, but I think fewer people talk about it. It's really simply that if something is more efficient, but is so unengaging that you never do it, you will not learn anything. But if something is engaging, but inefficient, you will learn more slowly, but you will still learn. This means that for the significant portion of the population that doesn't actually like language learning, a consistent routine over the long term in an inefficient but heavily gamified platform like Duolingo might actually be the best route to learn a language, especially in the beginning stage when it's very difficult to engage with material which is interesting for its own sake, or to hold a conversation in your target language. There's a big hump, I think. I always think the beginning stage of learning a language is a lot harder, and really the intermediate stage for me is a lot more enjoyable because once you reach the intermediate stage, it's a lot easier to practice doing things you actually enjoy doing, and you don't just have to practice something because that's a thing you need to learn before you can really hold a full conversation. Now, if you're someone who either doesn't really like the heavily gamified aspects of Duolingo, or someone who enjoys studying languages for its own sake, for the sake of studying, then I think it's easy to view Duolingo as borderline useless and annoying, without appreciating the value it does have for other people. But for those of you who do like Duolingo, I think it is worth noting, it's kind of necessary to look at what I think are three of the most useful features that Duolingo has gotten rid of. So first, this is the big one a lot of people are really aware of, the forums. It used to be able to learn grammar and rules through Duolingo, even though Duolingo has never actually explained anything itself very well. And this was because behind every Duolingo exercise, there was a little forum button. You could go there and you could talk with the community. And there was a gold mine of volunteer created comments explaining everything normally quite well. And if it didn't make sense to you, you could ask like a backup question or something. This was ultimately scrapped and has been replaced by AI explanations. And I haven't tried the AI explanation tool myself, so I can't speak to it specifically firsthand. But in my experience, AI is right most of the time, but often, still often wrong. And this leads to a problem where, as a learner, you don't always know how to distinguish between when an AI is giving a good answer, correct answer, and when it's giving a confidently wrong answer, because from your perspective, they look the same. And there's a kind of vacuum created by the forums, which seems to be mostly filled with things like Reddit, where I do think there is a certain tension between the people who are trying to understand a weird Duolingo sentence or whatever subreddit is tired of trying to explain individual questions like this, or they're simply tired of Duolingo as a topic at all. And this has grown worse as Duolingo has moved away from user generated content and more to AI generated content, which is often unnatural and confusing, and not really in the goofy, charming way of funny Duolingo volunteer created sentences of the days of yore, but in a weird AI, a human wouldn't say this kind of way. But I do think there are many use cases where Reddit is a great place to find to replace the forums. It's a great place to find other resources or grammatical explanations. It's just not is specialized for Duolingo sentences, but will ultimately be more helpful for finding other resources and opinions about how to learn. You might really love Duolingo and then go on to Reddit or another community and learn that there are other ways to study languages, and some of them might connect very well to you, might love them. Alternatively, you can study primarily from a textbook or other resource, maybe a class, and use Duolingo as a buttress for your grammatical understanding. This is really kind of what I did. I didn't rely so much on the forums to understand the Duolingo sentences, but I had already studied a lot of grammar, and I was trying to cement that into my head when I was using Duolingo. The second feature that Duolingo has gotten rid of that is super helpful and makes me sad that it's no longer there is immersion. Duolingo used to have a feature called immersion. Basically, you could translate a document as a community, anything that was in the public domain, often things like Wikipedia articles or the Little Plants, or I remember I uploaded some Jules Verne novels to this, and I translated quite a few books just this way, and I read them in French, and I learned a lot of French that way. I don't remember doing it so much with Spanish, but I definitely did a lot with French, and that was really cool. It's a great way to learn. And you would hover over a word, and it would give you a translation of each word, and you would select a sentence and make a translation, or you could vote on a translation of someone else had already made a translation for that sentence. And so as a learner, it was a nice way to kind of get into things. You could read through a document that had already been translated and see how other people translated it to really kind of understand, to make a good back formation of how the language works. Or you could start off with easier sentences and build your way up to harder ones, and you got this reinforcement that someone thought you did do a good job, or maybe you'd make a mistake and someone would correct you and you could learn from your errors. And I haven't quite seen anything else like this, and I really liked it. You can make a personalized version just with like an e-reader, looking up words easily, or a PDF on Google Drive, and like a Chrome translation extension. But I don't think I've ever seen anything that reproduces the community aspect so well. And in general, I think reading is very helpful for language learning, and I think the Duolingo immersion tool was super helpful to opening my eyes to the utility of reading. And it really is truly for me a shame that it's not around. And ultimately, this shows, something that hopefully most people will already be aware of. That outside of Duolingo, you need to expose yourself to content created in your target language to practice. It's just, after a certain point, going to be either much more efficient or even necessary once you're no longer a beginner. Third thing that Duolingo got rid of that I think is kind of a tragedy is classes. And basically, during the pandemic, Duolingo offered Zoom classes that might just be a conversation space for learners, a place for language exchanges, or even literal classes guided by a teacher. And some of them were free, and some of them were paid, but normally pretty inexpensive. This was a way to actually talk in the language on Duolingo, or outside of Duolingo, really. And you can get a similar experience in apps like Hello Talk, but the free version normally has a time limit, and honestly often doesn't feel as focused on language exchange, which I think is bad. I really liked having the opportunity to talk to other people who were learning a language mixed in with native speakers, and it's really hard to find that in my experience with things like Hello Talk. The next best thing would be really hiring a tutor, which is great if you have the money. It's definitely a great investment, for a whole bunch of things beyond what I'm talking about here. But obviously, it's not accessible. You have to pay. You have to pick a specific time. It's not nearly as casual, and it's hard to really kind of build up friendships this way. I think with a tutor, you always have like a relationship on kind of a professional basis, and it won't feel as much like you learning or practicing with a peer. Honestly, of the Duolingo features that I thought were useful, Duolingo classes are the one I miss the most, and I do currently host two weekly groups, one for Spanish and one for French, that started off as Duolingo groups. And I would love to be able to start or join others for different languages. That would be wonderful to just, have a good place to practice in kind of a casual setting, but still have it be focused on language exchange. And I think all of this really does go to show that we should be aware that Duolingo's goal is not to teach. Despite its supposedly noble founding idealism, it's not even the goal of Duolingo to be fun. Duolingo's one and only goal is to make money, and any feature which does not net a profit in some way will be taken away because it is a detriment to that goal. So if you want to ask me whether I think you should use Duolingo, the answer is if you think you could reliably form a habit around Duolingo to continually use it every day for a very long time, or if you are looking for a fun, gamified way to explore new things, then you might want to consider it. Outside of that, probably not. But honestly, the truth about learning languages is that there is no truth. There is no secret. It's a few separate skills, and as long as you find a way to practice reading, writing, speaking, and listening, you will improve. As long as you expose yourself to the language and you try to produce things in that language, especially with feedback about whether you produced it well or whether you made a mistake, you will improve. And you should find the methods you enjoy the most to do these things. If you love studying, open a textbook. If you love music, memorize some songs in your target language. If you love video games, play them in your target language. Write about the things you love in your target language. Read interesting stories and articles. Make friends or talk to the people you like in your target language. If you like Duolingo or Anki or Memrise, don't worry if it's the most efficient way to learn. Just study and enjoy, and when you stop enjoying it, try something new. There is no secret path. There are hundreds of paths, and they are all long and difficult. So pick the one that looks the prettiest, and don't feel afraid to change paths if you no longer like the one you are on. Now, if you want to hear my review for Coffee Break Italian, you can click over here, but don't forget to drop me a like, and remember, good night, good day, good potato. Boom!